There we go.
When Harriet Beecher Stowe took up her pen to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, she did so with purpose. She used one of the few outlets available to women at the time, her writing, to advocate for change. The story she crafted inspired people to action, and while her work is very much a product of Stowe's time and position, we seek to continue her legacy of using literature and narrative to illustrate true histories and work towards social justice. Today, as part of our Spirits at Stowe, Spiritualism as Resistance programming, we are pleased to present Dr. Tracey Hucks. Dr. Hucks is a nationally known and esteemed scholar of Africana Studies and American Religious History, and is the Victor S. Thomas Professor at Harvard Divinity School and the Suzanne Young Murray Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She has served most recently as Provost and Dean of Faculty at Colgate University, where she has been a James A. Storing Professor of Religion and Africana and Latin American Studies. Dr. Hucks previously taught at Davidson College, where she was the James D. Vail III Professor and Chair of the Africana Studies Department, and was also Chair of the Religious Department at Haverford College. In 1995, she was a resident graduate scholar of the Obafemi Awolowo University in Nigeria. A graduate of Colgate University, she earned her AM and PhD from Harvard University in 1998. Dr. Hucks is the author of Yoruba Traditions and African American Religious Nationalism, which was published in 2012 and was a finalist for the American Academy of Religion First Book Award, and the Journal of Africana Religions Albert J. Rabateau Book Prize. Hucks is also the author of Obeah, Orisa, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, Volume 1, Africans in White Colonial Imagination, which was published in October 2022 by Duke University Press. Dr. Hucks has conducted research in several countries, including Brazil, Cuba, Nigeria, England, France, Trinidad, Jamaica, Kenya, and Tanzania. In addition to her numerous awards, fellowships, and distinctions, she was also an elected member of the program committee of the American Academy of Religion, elected member of the executive committee of the Society for the Study of Black Religion, and is currently a member of the Corporation of Haverford College. Dr. Hucks, thank you for being with us here today and to share your research and insights with us.
And welcome, Dr. Hucks.
I want to thank you for sharing your Saturday afternoon with me. I'm sure there are many things you could be doing in your leisure time, and I feel honored that you wanted to come and spend this time here with me and here at the Stowe Center. I want to express my gratitude to Kat White, to Karen Fisk, and to the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center for the invitation to be with you this afternoon in person, and also want to acknowledge those who are with us virtually, and to be a part of the Spirits at Stowe October program. It is my first time at the center, and as a historian of religion, I appreciate the restorative work you are doing here to preserve an important and contested historical figure in American religious history and women's literature. So thank you for that. Can everyone hear me? Oh, good. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin, slavery, they intersect various parts of my professional life. They intersect my teaching and the areas also that I research, and my recent scholarship, and they also intersect my professional life at Harvard University, and I'll talk a little bit about that toward the end of my talk. But I wanted to begin by sharing some background and the story of my first real encounter with Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, as well as the novel's impact on my current teaching as I explore in my classes both its social daringness and its social dangers. Some 30 years ago, when I was a doctoral student, I can't believe I'm saying that, I took a course at Harvard University entitled American Religious History to 1865, taught by David D. Hall, the renowned New England historian and Puritan scholar, who was just last month inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This course was the first time that I read in its entirety Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I am still often surprised at how many people refer to the novel, make reference to it in the kind of social vernacular, but have never read the novel cover to cover. And as someone who has, I can often tell the kind of references that they make, whether or not they came out of popular culture or whether they came out of a sense of having read the novel. So I picked it up in this course and I read it with a backdrop of over a century of visual images, theatrical performances, character memorabilia, social and stereotypical archetypes, cartoon reenactments. Some of you may be old enough to remember that cartoons were actually putting this on also, and the Little Rascals enacted Uncle Tom's Cabin. I read it in its representation of enslaved people of African descent, enmeshed with facts, fiction, and flaws. Among my many files that I've kept over the years, I recently came across a paper simply entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin that I submitted, and I wanted to just bring it here to you. April 29th, 1991, for Dr. Hall's graduate course. And so I read the paper and I read it decades later with renewed curiosity to remind me of my original thoughts on the novel, and with great interest to see how at that time I would have summed up its salient themes. I concluded the paper with the following. Finally, Stowe adds another subtle character in her religious paradigm, and that is nature. Throughout the novel, nature for Stowe assumes sides for either good or evil. It is good when it supplies aid and relief for the downtrodden, and evil when it aids in their oppression. And decades later, I find this understanding of nature as possessing some kind of moral agency quite intriguing, particularly as a scholar of African-derived traditions, where nature is the embodied entity for African deities and the source of healing, protection, and curing, as well as, and I'll talk a bit about this in the colonial Caribbean, as well as the source of criminalization and torture in the colonial Caribbean. Since my close reading of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the early 1990s, and this was the version that I actually read, there's something about the novel that has stayed with me, enthralled me, captivated me by its timeless malleability and social stamina. And for more than a decade, I have taught semester-long courses on the novel, one entitled Feminism, Evangelicalism, and Anti-Slavery in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And most recently this semester at the Harvard Divinity School, I'm teaching a course entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin and its Diaspora, which explores the landmark novel in its geographic, sociocultural, and racial diaspora and its enduring impact over space and time. I wanted to specifically teach this course at a divinity school where students who are earning Masters of Theological Studies and Masters of Divinity have an opportunity to engage the single text that in all of the 19th century was outsold and read in the United States only by the Christian Bible. And students find that fascinating, that the Christian Bible, not that the Christian Bible was the fastest and most selling book of the 19th century, but that Uncle Tom's Cabin was number second. And that still remains a fact. More broadly, we engage themes such as slavery, evangelicalism, religion and social reform, romantic racialism, social imaginary, race and representation, gendered authority, domesticity, and the mythic South. And because the novel's imagined literary ancestors still haunt the social and racial landscape of America some 171 years later. I mean, the characters in this book live on and on and on throughout the centuries. So here we are 171 years later, still having conversation, still having gatherings about Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so because they live on, I end with essays that invoke Uncle Tom's Cabin and Clarence Thomas. We read things such as Justice Clarence Thomas and Uncle Tom Acting White by Selling Out. These are some of the images that you see with Clarence Thomas associated with Uncle Tom, his actual quote, when he says, "I'm not an Uncle Tom, I'm going to be here for 40 years. For those who don't like it, get over it." And we also read, we'll be reading an article at the end, Justice Thomas, an insult to Uncle Tom, published in the Pittsburgh Courier, where the author, Dr. John Warren, in the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action, emphatically concludes, quote, "It's time to set the record straight. The Uncle Tom of Harriet Beecher Stowe's 1852 book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, had real character. While he appeared to be subservient and docile as a good slave, those characteristics were used to help him disguise the good he was actually about doing to help others. He had character that allowed him to put himself at risk helping others. Justice Clarence Thomas," he goes and says, "on the other hand, has shown that he is about helping himself first and always. All reveal what most of us already knew from the beginning, that Justice Thomas was and is always about his interests and not the people." He concludes by saying, "Let us no longer insult the life and story of Uncle Tom, which was actually based on the real life slave, Josiah Henson." End quote. And this article was published as recent as August 2nd, 2023. Yet ironically, the other class that I'm teaching this semester, so I teach two classes, one is on Uncle Tom's Cabin and his diaspora, and the other class that I'm teaching this semester at Harvard Divinity School that's in dialogue in some ways with Uncle Tom is a course that fulfills the requirement for scriptural interpretation, and it's called The Book of Baldwin, which is a course in intellectual history on the writings of renowned novelist, essayist, playwright, and civil rights activist James Baldwin. And in this course, Harriet Beecher Stowe permeates the writings of James Baldwin as he writes, and some of you may know the works on James Baldwin as he comments on Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. And he says, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a very bad novel in its self-righteous, virtuous sentimentality. Baldwin says Uncle Tom's Cabin, like its multitudinous hard-boiled descendants, is a catalog of violence. This is explained by the nature of Mrs. Stowe's subject matter, her laudable determination to flinch from nothing in presenting the complete picture, an explanation which falters only if we pause to ask whether or not her picture is indeed complete, and what constriction or failure of perception forced her so to depend on the description of brutality. And to leave for Baldwin the unanswered and unnoticed, what he calls the only important question: what was it, after all, that moved her people to such deeds? Or when Baldwin states, Uncle Tom is, for example, if he is called uncle, a kind of saint. He is there, he endures, he will forgive us. And this is a key to that image. But if he is not uncle, if he is merely Tom, he is danger to everybody. He will wreak havoc on the countryside. When he is Uncle Tom, he has no sex. When he is Tom, he does. And this obviously says much more about the people who invented this myth than it does about the people who are the object of it. End quote. I ultimately contend that Stowe's novel is still important as we continue to grapple with the timelessness of the meaning of race, slavery, and Blackness in our larger society, especially at a place like Harvard, where as an institution we are wrestling currently with what it means to have direct ties to African slavery, slave revenues, and enslaved human remains. Spirits at Stowe tours, and I know some of you are going on a tour, I think at 6 o'clock, so I will try to wrap up. Thank you for shaking your head. I'll make sure that we're done a little bit before 6 so you can be on time for your tour. And some of you who weren't planning on it might want to consider it as well. Spirits at Stowe tours primarily focus on the practices of 19th century spiritualism, a phenomenon of the late 1840s, beginning among white followers with the Fox sisters in upstate New York and knockings, but expanded to include practices such as hypnosis, mediumship, Ouija boards, and other paranormal encounters, as those such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Queen Victoria, and the First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln were those who participated in seances, where at the heart of these practices was communication with the dead. And I won't be giving anything away from the tour. Yet I am grateful to the Stowe Center for creating a platform for me to share my work on spirit, death, and religion as it relates decades earlier to African enslaved communities in the colonial Caribbean. It's a different kind of intersection between religion, death, and the supernatural. And it was one that was much more severe and brutal. My most recent book, Ovia, Orisha, and Religious Identity in Trinidad, Africans and the White Colonial Imagination, explores these violent interconnections between African religious and spiritual traditions and death as they commingle in the minds and imaginaries of white European colonists at the expense of African enslaved bodies. African spiritual practices in the US and the Caribbean in the early 19th century were not perceived as, in the 1840s, as innovations in assuaging souls or communicating with loved ones, but were seen as the spiritual practices of enslaved Africans in the British Caribbean. They were deemed as criminal, as nefarious. They were deemed sorcery and witchcraft. Knowledge of the dead or the natural world held by Africans translated into dangerous, poisonous, noxious, and injurious to white inhabitants in the colonies. When we place the spirit and death epistemologies of Stowe and others in the 1840s and beyond in the US in dialogue with Africans and their spiritual practices of resistance decades earlier in the Caribbean, spirit and death encounters with enslaved Africans are perceived radically different. The Africans of Stowe's imagination are innately religious. We see that in the figure of Uncle Tom. They were naturally sedentary and timid. In her view, they lacked the naturally aggressive and inquisitive qualities of Anglo-Saxons. And, quote, the African temperament was more naturally receptive to religion. According to historian of religion Curtis Evans in his outstanding book, The Burden of Black Religion, published in 2008, Stowe attributed Blacks' religious expression to their nervous organization that was peculiarly susceptible and impressible to the powerful stimulant of the Christian religion. Stowe noted that mesmerists had, quote, found that the Negroes are singularly susceptible to all that class of influences which produce catalepsy, mesmeric sleep, and partial clairvoyant phenomena. Her extended discussion of the different religious experiences of Black led her to conclude in the key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, quote, the Negro race is confessedly more simple, docile, childlike, and affectionate than other races, and hence the divine graces of love and faith, when inbreathed by the Holy Spirit, find in their natural temperament a more congenial atmosphere. Evans adds, we may sum up the central features of the naturally religious slave as imagined by Stowe and other romantic racialists as follows: docility, receptiveness to the divine, unquestioning faith, and an intuitive sense of the transcendent. Yet Evans is acutely insightful in pointing out that assertions that Blacks were naturally or innately religious changed in relation to Blacks' social, political, and economic situation. Being naturally religious was not a static concept, but its social and cultural meaning was profoundly affected by broader changes in the discussions about Black capacities and their place in the nation. Innate religiosity, for example, could mean feeling or emotion that was said to be unique to Blacks and a complement to the rational faith of whites, as in the case of Stowe and her white romantic racialist contemporaries. Or, so that's one reading of this naturally religious, or it could also mean the degraded practices of Native Africans. And this is what it meant in the Caribbean context. Those so-called innate traits, those innate religious understandings, were first perceived negatively, pejoratively, and in many ways of stemming from evil and the devil, quite malevolent. In researching and documenting the Caribbean story of spirit, death, and African religion, I echo the words of Harriet Beecher Stowe in the opening line of The Key. This is the very first line. And she says, "The work which the writer here presents to the public is one which has been written with no pleasure and with much pain." And I can talk more about that in the Q&A, about how difficult it was to research what I'll be sharing with you about my work in the Caribbean and Trinidad regarding spirit, death, and religion. And that, like Stowe, it was with much pain. And I now want to shift, from my own research in the colonial Caribbean. In the British Caribbean, which is where I did my work in Trinidad, I did starting with the 15th century and going to the end of the 19th century. In the British Caribbean, the religious and spiritual practices of Africa become symbolized and demonized as something that they called obia. It was almost a kind of taking an African word that meant largely something that was about healing in communities, and pretty much use it in a way as though it was something that was malevolent. And so they used this word obia, and resulting in colonial legislation, religious fear and trembling, social panic, and a perceived threat to Christian domination. Throughout the British Caribbean, the colonial imagination perceived what they call obia as an illusory threat encompassing African sorcery, witchcraft, revolt, divination, poisoning, fetishism, superstition, and religious weaponry against slavery. Obia's inclusion in the legal lexicon of the British Caribbean appeared in 1760, shortly after the slave uprising of Tacky's revolt in Jamaica. And it began with what was called an act to remedy the evils arising from irregular assembly of slaves in 1760. It was the first anti-obia legislation in the British colonies. The law stated, quote, and I'm quoting from this, any Negro or other slave who shall pretend to any supernatural power and be detected in making use of any blood, feathers, parrot beaks, dog's teeth, alligator's teeth, broken bottles, grave dirt, rum, eggshells, or any other material relative to the practice of obia or witchcraft, in order to delude and impose on the minds of others, shall upon conviction suffer death or transportation. Following suit, obia laws proliferated throughout the British Caribbean. In Trinidad in 1800, remember, these are still slave colonies when these laws are being proliferated. In Trinidad in 1800, in Barbados in 1806 and 1818, and throughout most of all the British colonies, such as British Honduras, British Guiana, St. Vincent, Grenada, Antigua, and Dominica over the next 3 decades. British Caribbean colonial intradiscourse on obia legislation often centered on the public assembly of slaves, poisoning, supernatural power, the use of instruments or materials for witchcraft, and the fraudulent intentions and impositions on the minds of others. African traditions in the Caribbean were viewed not with the Christian piety of Uncle Tom. Trinidad slave codes, ordinances, and prosecutions would single out amulets, fetishes, and charms as malevolently potent devices of obia. In actuality, what white colonists most feared was that Africans arriving in the New World with pharmacopoeic knowledge about nature, plants, and the natural world. They possessed sophisticated skills on how to access healing properties of herbs and flora for healing, protection, defense. The social and economic condition of slavery did not preclude the fact that Africans were inheritors of a highly complex divination system, were specialists in spiritual technologies with the power to diagnose illness and affliction, to alleviate and heal, to foretell and predict, as well as were highly skilled to fabricate prophylactic charms and protective roots. And I like to point this piece out because many of you may recall, how many of you read the narrative of Frederick Douglass? And you may remember this in Douglass. And for those of you who haven't, it falls in a tiny footnote in the early narrative, but in My Bondage, My Freedom, when he writes a more extensive narrative, you find the story even more pronounced. And he wrote in his American slave narrative when he encountered the enslaved African Sandy Jenkins, who Douglass called a genuine African, who inherited some of the so-called magical powers said to be possessed by African nations. Seeking to make sense of these African practices within this diasporic context, Douglass could only say in conclusion that Sandy, quote, professed to believe in a system for which I have no name. It was this ineffable spiritual system of no name that British colonists codified as obeah and threatened its slave colonies. So in the narrative, he meets Sandy Jenkins, and Sandy gives him a root and tells him to wear this root within his pocket, and that if he goes back to the plantation, that Mr. Covey will never beat him again. And he goes and he picks a particular root, wears it as he's instructed. He goes back to the plantation, and when you read this very closely, he encounters Mr. Covey, and they fight. And they fight. Does anyone remember how long it says in the narrative? 2 hours. So it's 5 o'clock. If we started now and waited until 7 o'clock, that's how long Frederick Douglass said he fought with Mr. Covey. And then he eventually, runs away. And I thought it was quite interesting that even though he knows how these traditions are being perceived, he still decides to put it in both of his narratives. He still wants to give Sandy Jenkins and these African spiritual ways a place of affirmation in his own journey. The violent collision of African spiritual practices in Trinidad and the colonial public converge in the archives under the leadership of Governor Picton. Governor Thomas Picton, who ruled Trinidad from 1797 to 1893. Trinidad was a very late slave colony. It had been colonized by the Spanish, and the Spanish decided they had their lucrative colonies, Cuba being one of them. So they had not really developed Trinidad as a slave colony. When the British take it over in 1797, they decide they want to create a slave colony, but they want it to be like Barbados and Jamaica, which had been their most lucrative slave colonies. But overall, Trinidad, when it starts about maybe 1797, they begin this work, early 1800s, but then by 1838, British Caribbean slavery is being abolished. So it's one of the most short-lived slave colonies, but I would argue one of the most brutal because of that. And one of the key things to keep in mind is it is being formed within the shadow of the Haitian Revolution of Saint-Domingue. And so when you see this kind of excessive brutality visited upon African people by Sir Thomas Picton, throughout much of the archives, there is this anxiety that Trinidad is going to be a Haiti and that the white people will be massacred. And so he rules with extreme brutality and zero intolerance. All of what I will put in here is only a portion of what's in the larger book, but he ruled through extreme intimidation also. And so I talk a little bit about that these punishments were about a kind of performance for an entire colony and keep an entire colony in place. But also in front of the governor's house, he would keep a place where one could be hanged. So you might come to his dinner party and someone is literally being hung there. And he would say that he wanted to make sure that everyone knew that they could potentially have what he called wind beneath their feet. Governor Picton supported colonial laws against Africana religions, or what the British colonial rulers understood as obeah. He is a British colony. He is back and forth with the king about not wanting to bring more Africans into the colonies, particularly from Saint-Domingue. But because they're trying to develop this colony very quickly, they need as much African labor as they can. And so they open up Trinidad to all those who, at that particular point, under the Spanish, who were Catholic and owned slaves. And there's a whole bunch of incentives that one would get in bringing enslaved labor into Trinidad. And so I argue that obeah were predicated on a European belief in both its seditious efficiency and the civil need to contain its power. Obeah's African power, and this is an image drawing of a ceremony in Trinidad. Obeah's African power, often attributed by colonists to the devil and imagined malevolent spirits, was believed accessible by quote unquote spell doctors and obeah men and obeah women serving as its spiritual specialists and agents. The term obeah served in the colonial lexicon as an all-encompassing rhetorical device for categorizing all kinds of slave religious and medicinal practices, herbalism, divination, spirit possession, and in most colonial authorities, always use it to mean witchcraft rather than religion. Therefore, obeah's practice had to be criminalized and deemed illegal in Trinidad in order to protect the plantation system and European civil order from its perceived venomous powers, thus reinforcing an unspoken objective of supernatural protection and civil order. Just 3 years after the British acquired the island of Trinidad from the Spanish, Article 11 of Governor Picton's 1800 Slave Code in Trinidad stated, and this is coming from Picton, quote, any Negro who shall assume the reputation of being a spell doctor or obeah man, and shall be found with an amulet, a fetish, or the customary attributes and ingredients of the profession, shall be carried before the commandant of the district, who will take cognizance of the accusation, and provided the crime be not capital, inflict proper punishment. And with referential subtext to poisoning within this act, the ordinance further stipulated, quote, but should it appear probable that the culprit has been the cause of death of any person by his prescriptions, as very frequently happens, the commandant will transport him to the jail as a criminal to be prosecuted and dealt with according to the law. And it often meant death. It was transporting, but it often meant death. Implicit in Colonel Picton's slave code was an unspoken belief in the African power of obeah and its capacity to not simply communicate with, but to occasion death. Slave insurrections posed one social threat, while the dangers of obeah practices were at times viewed seemingly as lethal. As a military leader, Governor Picton believed fortifying the colony against foreign and internal threat was his first order of business. Picton, along with every other administrator of an English colony, was on high alert following the eruption of revolts in France's Caribbean territories. Historian Elsa Gouveia writes, the rebellions of the free, colored, and slaves, which followed the spread of the French Revolution in the French islands, and especially in the great colony of Saint-Domingue, were horrifying to the West Indians in the British Islands, who feared for the survival of their own society when they saw the revolutionary assault launched against the barriers of color elsewhere. End quote. Gouveia captures the mood of the West Indies during these turbulent moments and says, whites foresaw a dissolution of their society and trembled for their safety. Picton's governorship targeted and isolated the purported incendiary African magic of obeah as an insurgent crime warranting the severest punishments, which fueled his license to disregard as the boundaries of constitutional normalcy. According to Chris Evans, Enslaved Wales, the Welsh and Atlantic Slavery, 1660 to 1850, quote, Picton appointed tribunals against slaves practicing obeah, a term encompassing both African magic and all forms of African religious rituals, and punishments for practicing what was deemed witchcraft included burning, hanging, whipping, and mutilation. And I wanted to stop there because, and there are other parts where we'll stop because it only gets worse. This is just to kind of set this up, but you know, one of the things that is common in some classrooms are to give trigger warnings, and so almost to the end, it's a trigger warning. And above all, Picton and colonizers in England, they dreaded obeah as a form of African sorcery, completely divorced from the category of true religion, and they targeted the African body as a location for enacting their exorcisms of personal trepidations and social fear. Obeah existed at the center of a precarious social universe of moral complexity, where colonial officials, estate owners, overseers, and African captives operated in complete ethical divergence. Historian of religion Charles Long avows, quote, slavery and its practice defined an agonistic site, a battlefield, or better, a minefield that camouflaged and obscured within its pacific domesticity, a strange and depressing dialectic of evil. Within this dialectic of evil, obeah encompassed the social bodies of Black persons as they navigated and resisted societal evil. Obeah practices linked to insurgency and viewed as lethal hazard to the colony of Trinidad. In fact, British colonists resembled their Francophone Caribbean neighbors whose magio-religious outlook contributed greatly to their fear of the slaves, to whom they attributed dark powers. According to Michelle Goldwasser, Picton feared a Black rebellion, and African magic created the energy for revolt. He viewed African magic as necessarily injurious to a colonial public based on slave labor and a plantation economy. Under Picton's governorship, this perceived incendiary African magic was targeted and isolated as an insurgent crime. Picton's torture cells were linked to gruesome performances of judicial torture, and his legislative rulings were akin to that of the Portuguese in Brazil and the Dutch and Danish slave colonies, who unapologetically passed ordinances which, quote, provided such punishments for the crime of slaves as pinching and branding with hot irons, dismemberment, hanging, and flogging. And this is throughout so much of the colonial documents during his time. And this is where approaches to my historical research diverge considerably from that of Stowe. Stowe states in the key that, quote, the writer acknowledges, and she's talking about herself, that the book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is a very inadequate representation of slavery. And it is so necessarily for this reason, that slavery in some of its workings, she said, is too dreadful for the purpose of art. A work which should represent it strictly as it would be work which could not be read. So she said if she showed the true brutality of her novel, one wouldn't be able to read it. However, in researching through colonial archives, how African spiritual and mystical practices were violently and brutally interpreted, my sense was not that this could not be read for the purpose of art, but must be unearthed and told and read for the purpose of history. And as I conducted my research in the colonial archives, it only got worse and more dreadful. And this actually wasn't the project that I was looking for. I wanted to look for early African practices that had been retained during slavery that were being used for curing, for medicine. And when I went to the archives, what I found was just the opposite. What I found was not healing. I found persecution throughout, and hundreds of pages of it. Governor Picton's lived practices of African religious suppression constituted a web of technologies of torture. He is credited with the introduction of various devices intended solely to coerce information, the use of the picket and the torture rack, to extort confessions from recalcitrant witnesses, coercive psycho-torture tactics, public corporal rites of intimidation, brutal executions, extreme forms of haptic violation involving branding, mutilation, burning, decapitation, public decomposition, amputation and dismemberment, and the sadistic afflictions such as being placed naked. This is, and I'm quoting from the archives, placed naked on a nest of stinging ants, being beaten until skin excoriated from posteriors, or being thrown into open graves and covered over while yet alive. Picton's singular fixation was to eradicate these racial spiritual threats through the violence of empire. For example, in 1802, and these, because they come up as criminal cases, they're recorded in the colonial records. In 1802, we have the case of the enslaved African La Fortune, who was convicted of obeah and, quote, having by his knowledge in the Black art discovered the use of herbs, of having by poisons caused sickness, of having distributed and sold pretended charms, and of having dangerous connections, end quote. As a result, La Fortune, along with others in the colonial record, was sentenced to a harrowing bodily fate, as he was, quote, and these are where the trigger moments come in, because I'm going to read his actual fate. He was, quote, condemned to be hanged, his head to be cut off, and exposed on the estate to which he belonged, and his body to be burnt, end quote. As a result of invoking defensive African spiritual technologies and cosmologies, La Fortune's fate as a burned corpse and symbolically exposed head on the plantation estate was a customary act in the British West Indies. And so this would be the entrance to the estate. So if you violated any of what were the colonial laws, particularly with obeah, they, in order to in order to intimidate those on your plantation, they would decapitate you, put your head on a pole at the entrance of your plantation. So any African and any person going by would have to live with a decomposed head. And it was a warning to everyone. So it wasn't just a punishment to the individuals, but it was actually a kind of collective psychological torture to have to see these at the entrance of plantations. Oh, I used to have a blank slide, so I wouldn't leave this one up. Sorry. It must have come out. For example, oh, and I won't leave it up. We'll go back. The physical dismemberment and deliberate incinerations function not only to destroy the agential sources of revolt, resistance, and insurrection, but also to wholly obliterate the Black body itself as embodied weaponry. And so you saw what I call these kind of hyper annihilations. Because these were spiritual crimes, the sense was you couldn't just hang the African body because the evil may have continued to dwell within. So you had to decapitate it, you had to burn it, you had to hyper annihilate it to make sure that the evil that was being promoted in the colony was completely extinguished. In 1801, Pierre Francois and Beauquet, two enslaved Negroes, along with Leonard, a mulatto, were vehemently suspected and found guilty of, quote, sorcery, divination, and poisoning by means of charms. As the recorded account indicated, Pierre and Beauquet suffered horrific physical punishments with the form. They were, quote, condemned to be burnt alive, and the latter to be hanged and his body to be burnt, having been, quote, confined in a solitary dungeon for 6 months previous to his being tried. Despite pronouncements of innocence, following the ruling, Pierre and Beauquet were conducted to the chapel where Beauquet was baptized by the curate of Port of Spain. Both were then heavily ironed and heavily fettered, and after that heard prayers, and I'm quoting. In the late afternoon, Pierre was chained to a stake with kindling beneath him and draped with a shirt of brimstone or sulfur. Beauquet was hanged and beheaded, and his headless trunk was laid on a stake alongside of Pierre Francois. And then, quote, both the living and dead were consumed in flames. Leonard, however, escaped execution and mutilation. He was forever banished from Trinidad. These and other acts of torture exemplified anti-African violence of Picton's British colonial rule. Enslaved Africans convicted of obeah or the spiritual black arts in Trinidad were consumed through rituals of social cannibalism in which black flesh became the spectacle of punishment and executions became spectacularized murders. There was the ferocity and finality of death that characterized these brutal acts. Yet further still, there lingered a profound deathlessness and immortality of the vanquished black nefarious body, a hank that loitered in the physical colonial landscape and subsequent imaginary. In early colonial Trinidad, as in other British colonial societies, publicly spectacled, these charred, headless, earless, hot iron branded black body parts demarcated the amuleted trophies of colonial power and spiritual warfare. Thus, social mapping and mutilation came to represent a new vocabulary of conquest and subjugation performed within the colonial public, with the black body and African spiritual practices conceptually fabricated by Europeans as material weapons of evil and malevolence in need of targeted annihilation. While modulating the supernaturalism of what colonists call obeah or sorcery through laws, colonists correspondingly subdued the African body and its extremities with an imagined public tapestry of racial graffiti as a means of violently terrorizing colonial power and empire, and of ultimately securing the colonial public. I go on to talk about how many of these executions were staged. There are accounts when the burnings are happening that white settlers who are living near these places have to actually leave their homes because the smellscape of it was so strong. Also, I also, go on to talk a little bit about this sense of viewership, what it meant to really try to have a kind of visual intimidation for the entire colony. And I conclude that section with saying physical dismemberment and incineration function not only to destroy the sources of revolt, resistance, and insurrection, but also to wholly obliterate the black body itself as in flesh weaponry. But this approach to the enslaved black African body was not confined to the Caribbean, but was very much a part of the United States. Criminal acts related to obeah and poisoning received, and it was called OBI here, OBI, receives especially hard reprisals in British North America's legal reign of terror upon enslaved bodies. The Swedish professor, Dr. Peter Kahn, remarked of his 1748 travels that enslaved Africans, both in the North and the South, and this is the US, had skills in the dangerous art of poisoning, and, quote, never disclose the nature of the poison and keep it inconceivably secret. The awareness of African expertise informed legislation action during this period, as in Virginia, where the colony passed what became a succession of what they call medicine laws against Africans, stating that, quote, any Negro or other slave who shall prepare, exhibit, or administer any medicine whatsoever would be subjected to death. Colonists believe wholeheartedly that, quote, many Negroes under pretense of practicing physic have prepared and exhibited poisonous medicines by which many have been murdered and others have languished under long and tedious indispositions, end quote. A 1751 amendment to South Carolina's Act for Better Ordering and Governing Negroes and Other Slaves in the province attempted to, quote, to prevent as much as may be all slaves from attaining the knowledge of any mineral or vegetable poisoning, by finding those who violated the prohibition of the employment of enslaved people by any physician, apothecary, or druggist. The same statute warned that, quote, in case any slave shall teach or instruct another slave in the knowledge of any poisonous root, plant, herb, or other sort poison, whatever, he or she so offending shall upon conviction thereof suffer death as a felony. Further, the law threatened corporal punishment, not exceeding 50 stripes for those enslaved people, commonly called doctors, who gave any medicine or pretend medicine to any other slave. And so we have in these laws in Virginia, 18th century, they talk about the Negro doctor or the conjurer to procure poison and believe that it was to, quote, to destroy white people. An enslaved man in Virginia, Tom, and this is not the Tom of Uncle Tom, there's another Tom who had a different fate than Uncle Tom. Well, similar fate, different reason. Tom was indicted for, quote, having prepared and exhibited medicine, which necessarily aligned him with the spiritual art, quote, art of conjuring or poisoning. Found guilty, Tom was condemned to be, quote, hanged by the neck until he be dead. Historian Vincent Brown's categorization of these acts of punishment, he calls them legal terror, is by no means hyperbole in the context of British slave colonies, where executions consisted of sporadic, localized dramas, primarily used to dramatize power and to set an example for other enslaved Africans. What we ultimately see in both North America and the Caribbean, vis-a-vis the Black body, are displayed mutilated emblems of white rule and sovereignty before a public colonial viewership. Severed Negro head poles posted on plantation estates and other municipal roads. So body parts, Black body parts weren't just at the plantation, they would be on municipal buildings, on courthouses, and they took ears off, put them in civic and public places, tacked them on trees, likely to admonish the enslaved that they better listen to colonial authorities, became acceptable ciphers of Black social regulation throughout the British Caribbean, including Trinidad. According to Brown, by using dead bodies as symbols, masters marked their territory with awe-inducing emblems of their power. In theorizing acts of recruiting dead bodies and parts of bodies to demonstrate their power, Vincent Brown masterfully proffers that the mutual alliance between civil and planter authority constantly shaped new social memory regarding Africans as embodied weapons, their malevolent religious practices, and their subjugated status within the British colonies. And I only have time to mention it briefly because it actually deserves its own lecture, that it was not until the abolition of slavery in the British Caribbean, and particularly in Trinidad, that African traditional practices would get a less malevolent representation. And you see that in one particular novel that I give an in-depth analysis of. It's an 1854 publication of Fannie Noy Wilkins's novel, The Slave Son, which was a novel written by an Irish Caribbean inhabitant. Her family, she was Irish, family owned a plantation estate in Trinidad. And she says at the very beginning, and it is published in 1854, that this novel of The Slave Son was directly inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. As I near to a close, I wanted to openly share that there was a lot of discourses on Black death and slavery circulating this project, both in the written text and in my immediate contemporary academic context. More specifically, there were incidents that had a profound impact on the completion and release of this book. I completed the final manuscript during the pandemic. It was published last fall during my first semester at Harvard, and its publication coinciding with the publication of the quote, the report of the Steering Committee on Human Remains in University Museum Collections, and also Harvard publishing, there's my blank slide, that was out. And Harvard also publishing The Legacy of Slavery at Harvard report, report and recommendations of the Presidential Committee. And in this report, it disclosed, this report uncovers Harvard's complicity with slavery and its legacies. And between the university's founding in 1636 and 1783, when slavery officially ended in Massachusetts, Harvard leaders, faculty, and staff enslaved at least 70 people, some of whom worked on campus where they cared for students, faculty, and university presidents, end quote. Moreover, it states, Harvard also benefited financially and reputationally from donations by slaveholders, slave traders, and others whose fortunes depended on human chattel, end quote. And as a result, Harvard has created an endowment of $100 million. Some of you may have heard about this. They created an endowment of $100 million for reparative work. And it has several kind of recommendations on how that money can be used. Regarding the former report on human remains, the university stated, quote, moreover, we know that skeletal remains were utilized to promote spurious and racist ideas of difference, to confirm existing social hierarchies and structures, as it reveals that Harvard's vast museum collections contain approximately 30 million items and specimens, including the remains of more than 22,000 individuals. Of this, Harvard disclosed that it is in its museum holdings, quote, it possessed the human remains of 19 individuals who may have been enslaved. With one committee member seeking to keep at the forefront that they were people too, the report went on to state that as members of this committee and the wider Harvard community, we have recognized that it is fundamental to our collective values, ethics, and morals to work to fully understand and assess the university's collection of human remains, especially those acquired under the structural violence of slavery and colonialism, as well as to determine our current moral and ethical responsibilities regarding these remains, and recommended that, quote, the individuals who have been identified as being enslaved or likely to have been enslaved, the university employs research and appropriate consultation with communities or lineal descendants to implement interment, reinterment, return to descendant communities, or repatriation of remains. In moving across geographies and a time span of 171 years since the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, James Baldwin and Harriet Beecher Stowe are my intellectual pendulums for this semester at Harvard, and as generations progress, they keep me in the struggle to prevent either of them from going into obscurity. In closing, when I asked my current students why they thought it was important to still read Stowe's novel, one student remarked, quote, in a nation and world still immersed in racial violence and injustice, reading Uncle Tom's Cabin gives invaluable historical context. It demonstrates the persistence of corrosive stereotypes and the terrible price paid when we fail to interrogate our societies and hearts. In a time of rising Christian nationalism and white supremacy, he adds, when religion is used as a tool of control and oppression, Harriet Beecher Stowe's clarity in discerning the difference between following the precepts of Christ and the use of religion as a justification for evil is sorely needed. While another student of Asian American descent stated, quote, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is a must-read for all Americans, residents of the U.S., and those who are interested in American history and culture. Its influence cannot be understated, as it was the second most read book in the 19th century next to the Bible. It was popular around the world, circulating across Europe, and was even the first American book to be translated into Chinese. While Stowe's portrayals of enslaved people in the story contain harmful stereotypes, such as the pitiful character Topsy, Stowe was a woman of her time and was writing with her audience in mind. She appealed to her woman readers, urging them to put themselves in the shoes of enslaved women, hoping for them to see the way enslaved women were mothers like them. With regard to men, Uncle Tom, the namesake of the book, represents a strong man who has a faith greater than all the white people and all the slave owners and overseers he encounters throughout his life. She concludes, this book was profoundly subversive for its time and was emotionally compelling to its readers, proving how soft power, emotion, and religion work together to stir changes into the souls of her readers. Thank you. So please, this is a time for conversation, comments, narratives about your own readings of the text that I'd love to hear also. Some of you who've read it or reread it recently, and what does it mean to come back to it, years later? But please, this is your time to engage. Yes.
I found it remarkable when you were talking about the healing practices of being outlawed, punishable by death. Because it seems that many Europeans and the white Americans were following similar practices, using amulets as protective stones and using herbs. Very similar practices. Can you talk about that?
Yes. I mean, these are very intimate worlds. I mean, the world of slavery is a very intimate world. People are living closely among one another. But because of that kind of social intimacy, there's a great fear also. So you have a place like Trinidad where the enslaved population was over 25,000, and the white population was about a little over 2,000. So when you think about, these were not many of those who were owning these British colonies were back in Britain, and they had overseers there. They weren't settler colonies in the same way some of the other places were. And so in the aftermath of Trinidad, of the Haitian Revolution, it was believed that all of these things could be employed to do evil and to harm whites. And it became a paranoia. I mean, you see that with Picton and the extremity that he goes to outlaw these pieces. But there's a contradiction. On the other hand, they had these large estates, and they appointed often Black women to be nurses to care for the sick. They were relying on their knowledge of herbs to actually heal them so that they can go back out into the estate and into the plantations. So you see this very interesting world of healing and harming, and the real ambiguity in terms of who does it. But if you were one of those nurses, because there was a case that that I talk about in the larger book, of a woman who was a nurse, and unfortunately she meets a really harmful fate, because they then accuse her. They said, well, she was the person closest to these individuals, and so she must have been the one to cause harm to them. When she was in the nursing house, she was actually just trying to be a nurse, but they accused her, until her death she said that she was innocent of that. But this is also a world where one did like epidemiology, like disease is rampant in these places also. And so people are dying. We know here, there's a lot of infant mortality. People are dying throughout. But when one cannot, in a slave context that's overwhelmingly African, when you can't come up with a reason why they're dying, it's easy to really point the finger and say it must be the kind of spiritual influence that Africans are having on these communities.
Are you talking about the whites or the Africans dying and the influence upon which ones, or both?
I'm talking about both. Both are dying.
So there's higher rates of mortality.
Yes. I mean, Trinidad has a smallpox epidemic. But the other thing that's happening is that European medicine is on the rise also. And so you're seeing in colonial newspaper, their tonics, their doctors who are having their own, and these were for sale. And these African forms of healing and pharmacopoeia are competing with that. So you have, Africans who are coming later, even after emancipation, when this is happening. There's like a kind of medical war going on. Do you do the homeopathic, or do you go with the Western medicine in that way? And they were seen as competition in what was becoming the rise of Western medicine. Yes.
In your research, I'm going back in time quite a bit. I'm aware of that. When you think about like Tituba, the Salem witch trials, and I believe some historians have said they think she might have come from what is like modern day Guyana. I wondered if you ever encountered anything in your research about she was accused of bringing over practices. Have you done any legal research?
When I read Aitutupa, it was the first thing I thought. One of the things that was just striking is that people underestimate how fast people are moving around. I mean, this is a time when people are in flux and they are heavily moving around. And Tituba was one of those who moves around. And had she been, on one of these islands, particularly British Guyana, she would have known that these practices would have been outlawed. Now, let me say this: it's not. Some of the cases that I found, I do think they were intentional poisonings. That when you have people who are captive and see the kind of brutality and no form, no way are they going to be free in this emerging slave colony, I think people do try to resist in whatever way they can. And they try to do this in ways that, so there was one enslaved woman, Bino, who gets accused of poisoning her mistress. And when she's testifying on behalf of herself, her mistress was a single woman. I think the husband may have died. And so she's a single woman. And Bino says, no, no, no. And she understood enough of what it meant to be a woman who was unprotected in these societies. So she says in the testimony, no, I wasn't trying to poison her. I put some quote unquote love powders in her chocolate so that she could get a husband. Now, we never know whether or not that was true or not, but in a society where women were vulnerable of all races, it was a very clever defense in case she was trying to. So she does admit that she put something in her chocolate, but she said it was love powders, and the woman doesn't die. I think she gets gravely ill, but she says she was trying to attract a husband for her and do good on her behalf. And so you see those, kind of interesting ways and strategies that African people had to navigate these slave colonies. Yes.
When I first came back from California
Mm-hmm.
and got back from practice, I came here several times to see what's going on because I'm always interested in the community I live in.
You mean here, the Stowe Center?
Yeah, Stowe Center.
Okay.
I'm a Yoruba from Western Nigeria.
Mm.
After visiting here, and I wrote this page, 2019, about my observation of, if I may read part of it. So this is what I concluded after participating in the program here for a while. Now I read. Out of everything that impressed me about her teachers, her sensitivities to her environment, her candor, motivation and determination to start, and she took corrective action as this change to make for a more tolerable society. Her connectivity towards her human and sensitivity, projecting that from her immediate environment to the rest of the world. First, before I go on, my undergraduate and graduate degrees are in electrical engineering. But because I grew up in a Yoruba community, so I consider that my graduate work in electrical engineering is to enable me to support myself, and my writing about my community comes from my Yoruba upbringing, where I grew up. My dad was the chief in a small place. So our home, our house was the deliberation of anything that happened in the small place. My father has a living room about this size. Something happens, the chairs in my father's house were set up, and all the elders were invited to my father's house to settle that. So as a kid, I observed that over and over and over again. My dad organized the sanitary inspection. My dad was the tax collector. My dad was the marriage counselor. So,
And I don't want to rush you along, but we only have about 10 minutes left.
yeah, but apart from, I gave this copy, my statement, I gave it to this center
Okay.
in 2019. But the comparing of the European sense of purpose, of time and space. I have two pictures here. I'm writing I'm on page 55, what I'm writing about this. This is at the Met in New York City. This picture is at the Met. This is the Yoruba people. And George Orwell statement by the United Nations. So comparing the European aspect of thinking with the African in Yoruba people in the world, in mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, we produce the best in the world compared to anywhere in China, anywhere in India, anywhere in Europe and the United States. So this is the example, this is one of the examples at the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. This is a characteristic of the human mind. And the ori, the head, everything that a person does is a function of the head. And how you use the head to improve your community, to be connected to your fellow human beings. So
Well, if I can just interrupt you, I'll just say this as it connects. One of the things that we're finding is because Africans were brought for labor, those kind of sophisticated cosmologies were never really understood. And the other thing that I'll say is that you get large populations of Yoruba coming into Trinidad around 1830s to about the 1860s, because at that time the slavery was still legal, but the slave trade had been abolished, and the British were, the British Navy were actually trafficking the waters. And when they found these slave ships, primarily Spanish and Portuguese, because slavery doesn't end for the Spanish stay in Cuba until 1886, and in Brazil 1888, they rescued these ships, and then they would actually relocate those captive Africans in British territories. And so the Yoruba specifically were a large population in the Rada who come to Trinidad. And so I just wanted to kind of make that connection for you. But I'll be willing to talk to you afterwards. I just want to see if anyone else.
I have a package for you.
Okay. All right. Okay. We'll do it. Yes, there's a last question out here. Yes.
I would just ask, I'm so sorry I was late. We ran into traffic. I came from, and I know you teach the novel.
Yes.
I was curious, how do you feel about the novel and its place in the literary canon as well as the historical importance?
Well, and one of the things that I said was, because I'm at a divinity school, and I have students who are getting their Masters of Theological Studies, their Masters of Divinity School. I thought many of them, but not all, going on to be Christian ministers also. I thought, and I'm trained as a historian of religion, and I thought historically, what one should not be able to leave and not know that, it's particularly in the 19th century, that this was the second read book. I mean, it is, 3,000, I think, copies the first day, 300,000 the first year, over 2 million, close to 2 million in circulation. One wishes one books could sell like that. I mean, and that's a whole other issue in terms of what it did to elevate her economically, also. But I teach it for that reason. And I teach it because I want, so when you have that August 2nd article that I showed, see if I can go back. I saw this, but there was an article. So when you're still seeing, the state senator calling Clarence Thomas Uncle Tom, and Clarence Thomas himself saying he's not Uncle Tom, and then others who are writing don't insult Uncle Tom with Clarence Thomas. I want there to at least be an academic space, an intellectual space where people can read the novel and know where these tropes, where these names, what they mean. Because Uncle Tom gets a particular read in American popular culture. But when they read the novel, they realize that Uncle Tom dies because he would not betray Black women. And that's a powerful piece. He dies because he would not betray Black women. And when they read that Emmeline and Cassie get to run away and that he is willing to be tortured to death rather than give them up, then you have a very different understanding and read of Uncle Tom in there. So it's really to keep a generation that's very presentist alive and very contemporary, and very much into quick things. It's, can you sit and read this novel? And when I've had young people do that, that's why I want to quote my students also. They are absolutely amazed, but they also have a certain kind of literacy, social literacy, when they hear the name Uncle Tom, when they hear Sambo, when they hear Aunt Chloe, when they hear Topsy, when they hear Marie St. Clair, when they hear these names, they'll be able to locate them and have a fluent sense, a literate sense of what that means. And so I still do think that it's a novel that is still if you're being trained to say American religious history, one cannot overlook Uncle Tom's Cabin, regardless of how you feel about the novel.
My kids had
yes.
And I said, who said
yes.
And I shouldn't say, why do you use the other word? And I just went through a
Mhm,
whole lot of
mhm.
just because. And
And what?
It was, I think this is literature. I think just
Well,
the raising kids in Farmington, and if you just want to, it's not okay to read this book, but I know.
But I think, thank you for your piece, because what we're trying to do is raise critical thinkers. And so when they read that, we want them to be able to debate the merits of this novel and what that means, because I'm afraid of the alternative, which is banning books.
Oh, yeah.
I'm afraid that someone else can determine which books get to be read and which books do not get to be read, and why, as opposed to having free inquiry and debate, and free thinking thought and freedom of speech to be able to debate these.
It's not a good word, but maybe I'm just too old fashioned.
Mm-hmm.
At the time that they're grown.
Mm-hmm.
You don't use that word, but now it's music and everything,
Mm-hmm. And there was some talk several years ago with Mark Twain and others, whether or not the words should be sanitized out of the books. And I was one to say, but I don't want history to be erased. I want people to know what the language of the time was. I don't want someone to come 100 years from now and censor the kind of speech that we had during our time because it doesn't fit a certain kind of social norm. I think there's a danger in that. But I also always want to cultivate that we can debate it, that we can come down on the side of James Baldwin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a bad novel. One could say that. Or we can come down on the side of others who are saying yes, it has these flaws and stereotypes that live on, but it's still important to read it because it has not died. You know, we have not funeralized Uncle Tom in this society. And, you know, the recent affirmative action case brought that all back up and brought that language all back up. So thank you for asking your question. It is 5:52. Enjoy your tour. Those of you. Yeah, thank you. Were there any questions online? Okay.